Welcome to Take 5 Action, brought to you by the Forest City Film Festival. My name is Matthew Downs, and this is a podcast about some people who inspire me and the movies that inspire them. As a young filmmaker, movies have made their mark on my life. And I believe that our favorite films can inspire us to dream bigger and even change the way that we look at the world. When I look up to industry professionals, I wonder what movies have inspired them to the heights that they've reached. So join me in conversation with creatives as we discuss the 5 movies that define their careers. This is Scene 1, Take 3, Action. For today's guest, I want to thank Chris Giroux for being here, and I want to welcome him to the show. Chris Giroux, he's the head of production for Vortex Productions in Toronto, working on films like Anything for Jackson and A Perfect Plan, which screened at the Forest City Film Festival in 2020. It's a great film. Really great bank heist movie that I think is just perfect. It's great. So I want to thank you for being here, Chris. You've also worked on Bed of the Dead, which is a great horror movie that I think is really just nuts. You worked with Black Fawn Films, right?
Yeah, I used to produce with Black Fawn Films. That's kind of how I got my start, especially into genre filmmaking. And I did, I think, 9 or 10 movies with them before transitioning over to Vortex as head of production there.
Awesome. Well, you're quite the indie movie maverick, right? You're like a horror movie, like indie guy. You're like the one to go to. So
I've definitely done a lot of horror movies in my time, which is fantastic. It's my favorite genre to work in, so I'm very honored.
Is it also your favorite genre to watch?
It's my favorite genre to watch, bar none, and definitely what got me into filmmaking. It started with that love for horror, so it just expanded from there. So I always love when I get to do a horror project, or when I see a horror project on the horizon. I always get really excited.
Well, I'm really glad to have you here, Chris, to talk about that. We've got some horror movies that we're going to be talking about today. Well, one horror movie we're going to be talking about today, and some other genre picks, but I am really grateful to have you here. And before we start, I want to actually get started with an icebreaker question. I've been thinking a lot lately. We're what now, like 10, 11 months into this lockdown, quarantine, COVID thing. And I've been thinking a lot lately about how much I miss movie theaters. Like a lot. I miss the theatrical experience. I miss going to a movie theater. And it's made me feel like pretty bad recently that I've been like, oh, I just miss it so much. So I've been trying to think every time I miss movie theaters and think like, oh, I want to go back to a movie theater. I try to remind myself that it wasn't always good times, and that sometimes there were some bad movie theater experiences. And the bad movie theater experiences are some of the ones that I remember most fondly, because like there are some absolute lunatics in the movie theater. So I want to hear your bad movie theater story. You can think about it. I'm going to start with mine, which is when I thought I was going to be murdered when I went to see Joker. Because if you remember when Joker was coming out, there were all these like threats out there, and there was all this buzz around like, is something violent going to happen at a Joker screening? And so I saw Joker on opening day, despite all of the warnings. And there was this guy who was sitting beside me who was like fiddling in his bag, and just like he was just like going through his bag the entire movie, fiddling with something heavy in his bag. And he was like enjoying it too much. He was like laughing hysterically through the entire movie. I was very concerned for my life. I was like, is this how I go? Watching Joker.
One of the best movies of that year. So,
absolutely.
what a final film to watch if that was your final film.
I know. I would not have been upset. Like, I would have been upset to be murdered by a crazy man watching Joker. But like at the same time, it's Joker. It's a great movie.
Yeah, it's a great movie.
So
I
want to hear yours.
My first job ever was actually working at a movie theater. So I have 101 good, bad, happy, and sad moments of working at a movie theater and experiencing.
That's an amazing job to have.
It's still to this day my favorite job. So if
watch out, Vortex
old manager
Productions
from 17 years ago at Famous Players Burlington, if you're listening, I'll take my job back anytime. It was my favorite. But yeah, I think the craziest moment was always at the end of the night where you had to like clean the theater, the final screening of the night, and you had to go through. And for the most part, it was always, cups and popcorn and the generic garbage that you would expect to find in a movie theater. but we have found everything from extra large pizza boxes to bottles of Jack Daniels to like wigs. Oddly, a
Wigs?
lot of wigs. Yeah, I don't
Why
know
would
why people are
why would
smuggling in
people for
wigs.
I get smuggling them in, but like
Yeah,
why would you forget it there? That's
yeah.
expensive.
So it was just a variety of lost and found items that you're like, what is this doing here?
Yeah.
It was always very bizarre. So at the end of the night, it was always like, what are we gonna find? Because usually you would find some weird item by the end of the night.
Did you
So
guys
that
like
was always
auction them off among the employees? Like who's gonna take
I
this?
yeah, it's a, who's gonna take this random wig we found in
Yeah.
like Kangaroo Jack.
Yeah.
Uh,
I'm gonna guess it was always you. You always got the
it was
wigs.
always me. That's how I got my huge wig collection.
Exactly.
So
Extensive wig collection.
yes, extensive, absolutely.
All right, so we're going to move on right into our topic of the day. We're going to move right into the meat of our podcast. So, the concept of this podcast, I've asked Chris to provide me with 5 movies of his life. So, I've given Chris 5 categories that kind of correspond to different parts of his career and life in general. And Chris gave me 5 movies. So, we're going to go through each of these categories and kind of discuss each of these movies. So, by the end of the show, we'll have 5 movie recommendations for you guys, and we'll have a discussion kind of going through a life in movies. We're both massive geeks, so this is going to be a really fun, really interesting discussion. So, starting us off, the first category that I gave you, Chris, was inspiration. So, this is the movie that kind of got you into movies, that inspired you to, look deeper at movies and think of movies as an art and something that you really love. And the movie that you gave me here was Star Wars. So, I think everyone has like a Star Wars memory. Like everyone has a memory that they associate with Star Wars, whether they've seen it or not. So I want to hear what's your Star Wars memory?
Yeah, it's probably the movie that I've seen the most through my life, and I vividly remember I had all the action figures. I still have all the action figures, and I had posters and T-shirts and bed sheets and everything that was Star Wars. And I just remember being so immersed in it when I was a child that it seemed so fantastical. It seemed so unique, and there was definitely been science fiction projects before and definitely countless after that have tried or inspired like Buck Rogers and things like that. But there was something about Star Wars to me that when I first saw it, it was like when I would put in the VHS tape and it would just the music would start, the 20th Century Fox music, and it would just get me, like the hairs in the back of my neck would stand up. And I just remember slowly kind of finding out that, like, obviously I knew that this was a film, but it was like people made this. And it was just like this mind blowing experience about how, this, more or less one person thought of this such grand idea and was able to, put that on film. It was just groundbreaking. It had scary moments and romantic moments, and it had action moments and comedy moments, and it really did just touch upon this perfect storm of everything that I really liked, especially at the time and forever. That it had these elements of classic cinema and just so much care went into it. It just, for me, I still get chills. My girlfriend has never seen the Star Wars saga in its entirety, so we watched it over Christmas. And even watching
Oh,
it with
nice.
her, I felt like I was 8 years old with action figures, and I just felt like I was right back in that world for the first time. And just to see how that franchise and one idea has grown from this single seed. You go along all the way back to A New Hope, like the original, the first one, and now you have spin-off shows and spin-offs from spin-offs, and magazines and comic books and action figures, and it's really kind of taken on a life of its own. And as you mentioned, like whether you know Star Wars or don't know Star Wars, or you're obsessed with Star Wars, or you've never seen it, you know it. You know pop culture references from it. Really significant plot points, and you may have not even seen it. The whole, Luke, I'm your father is a pop
Oh, it's
culture
iconic.
phenomenon. So it just really, really started my love for cinema. I liked the movie so much as a child that my dad actually had to buy replacement VHS tapes because I would run them
Wow.
out.
That's
So
impressive.
I was just obsessed. It was just crazy obsession in a good way. Crazy
Yeah.
obsession.
Well, for any of our audience members that haven't seen Star Wars, which you might be a little bit, I don't know how many wouldn't have seen Star Wars, but just to recap what the plot of Star Wars is, it's about a farmhand who joins a cult and decides to overthrow the government. Is that right?
It's very
That's
accurate.
okay.
Very
That's about right. But it's a small indie movie. You might not have heard of it, right? But I think Star Wars is it's just that is the magic of movies, just distilled
Totally.
into like this crazy massive series. Like it's just magical the way that they you know I don't know the the thing that I love about Star Wars is that the second that that movie starts going, and the second that the music boots up, you know what you're in for, and it's just
Absolutely.
magical, right? It is absolutely yeah. I have to ask, what's your favorite of the whole saga?
It definitely fluctuates. I'm very passionate about Return of the Jedi. I think that I'm a huge Ewok fan, and I love the conclusion. I always find that with storytelling, you can get me really excited early on in the film or the story, but it's kind of how you land the plane. It's how you kind of conclude that story and make sure that those loose threads are all actually tied up. I find that the ending for Return of the Jedi does have that for me. It does have that. If there was never another Star Wars movie ever made, it ends on a note in which I feel very satisfied. And but I always obviously love Empire Strikes Back. It's notorious for being the fan favorite across the entire Star Wars saga. But there's something about Return of the Jedi that I just when Luke enters kind of Jabba's palace and he's kind of the man in shadow, the man in black. There's just so many references to westerns, to samurai films, to science fiction
Oh yeah.
films that it's really a love letter
Mm-hmm.
to science fiction as a whole.
I I'm a huge Kurosawa fan,
Mm-hmm.
and so like just to come back to Star Wars after I found Kurosawa like years and years ago, and I'd watched Seven Samurai and The Hidden Fortress. Then to go back to Star Wars and see all the samurai imprints and like the little notes that George Lucas left all over the place that are like it's really just a love letter to these like crazy big action movies from Japan,
Yeah,
as well
and
as
it's like Luke Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi is the samurai type path with the Jedi and the Sith, and Han Solo is the good, the bad, and the ugly. He's the
yeah,
cowboy.
he's
He's
Clint
got the
Eastwood.
low riding gun. He's got his sidekick instead of a horse is Chewbacca. Like it follows the tropes of a western. It follows the tropes of a samurai film, and it just has this perfect marriage.
All right, one final question before we move on to the next. I just want to hear your thoughts because this is clearly a childhood favorite of yours. You said you ran out the VHS tape that you were watching it on. So I just want to know what is it that stood out to you then versus now? Like, is there anything that you see now that you didn't see as a kid? Is there like different reasons that you appreciate Star Wars now versus then?
I think that when I first watched it, I just loved the adventure, and it came around the same time that I was experiencing movies like The Monster Squad or The Goonies, or just this fantastical group of friends or strangers or misfits that have to go on an overarching journey, which is a fan favorite of mine, and I think that it's a very relatable story to most. Now I see those references. I see those signatures on the wall. I see the fanfare that Lucas and company were kind of injecting into Star Wars, and I also use it as this benchmark to say, there was a person, George Lucas, who created it all, but before Star Wars, he was a film student with big ideas, and he was just wanting to get into cinema, and the idea of making mainstream films in his idea wasn't necessarily his end goal. He wanted to make something that was more or less for him, and if it happened to find a mainstream audience, then that's cool too. And now there's nothing more mainstream than Star Wars. It's the ultimate mainstream pop culture saga. So it's just this idea of this independent filmmaker going from, American Graffiti or THX to, making Star Wars as like, what is this going to be? There's no, 6 picture deal. There's no, idea that they're even going to do a sequel. It was, here's this one-off movie. Let's see what happens. And it changed cinema forever. So I appreciate that more and more after I rewatch it.
Awesome. So we are going to move on to our next category. So the second film that I asked Chris to give me was a film that defined exploration for him. So exploration kind of meaning he's discovered movies, he's discovered that he really loves cinema. As he explores, what's one movie early on in that exploration that really stood out and kind of changed your life? And the movie that you gave me here was Night of the Living Dead, which is a classic, 1968, George Romero. It's the zombie. It is the zombie movie. Now, Chris, you're a genre guy, right? You produce a lot of genre movies. Do you think Night of the Living Dead is where that like love affair with horror began, or did it go back further?
I can trace it all the way back to Night of the Living Dead. I remember finding, like a VHS in my parents' basement, and it's a fan favorite film in my family as well. My parents love it and things like that. And I just remember seeing this black and white VHS cover, this case, and it had monsters on it, and they weren't nice monsters like Star Wars. They weren't, even bad monsters like in Star Wars. These were different. These had a different tone and a different vibe. Just by looking at them, there was something very sinister. And when you look at, like a film like Star Wars, there's tons of fantastical creatures and monsters and things like that. But there is something whimsical about those types of monsters, and even the monsters in the Monster Squad, or Universal monsters like Dracula and Frankenstein. But looking at these photos that were on the back of this case, there was something seriously wrong with these people. And it just intrigued me so much. And when I was starting to, very early on talk to my public school teachers or high school teachers about cinema and about, hey, I want to make movies. This film came right into my life as an accessible film to make movies. This wasn't Star Wars. You didn't need hundreds of millions of dollars to pull off a franchise. This was a self-contained film that took place generally in one location with a very limited cast, and it was shot with resources that he could gather. And breaking out with a black lead, and with really driving forward this force. I've never seen a movie like this. It was damsel in distress meets like pure nightmare. And the movie still bothers me. It still haunts me as this perfect picture that just gets under my skin. And for my birthday every year, minus COVID, I always rent a movie theater and I open it up to the public or my friends to come and enjoy movies that I've selected. And the last one before the COVID shutdown was Night of the Living Dead, the 4K Criterion Collection. And I got to watch it with my parents, who I've grown up watching it with, but also friends and family who have never seen this iconic film. And I always look back to say there's no Walking Dead without Night of the Living Dead. There's no mass zombie craze 28 days later.
Without.
You would never have any of it. Yeah. And it was just so accessible, the film. And it really changed the game for me, because here was an independent film. This was made with passion and love. This is the definition of an independent film, shooting films on weekends, using tales of the film to actually produce the picture. And I had an opportunity to talk with George A. Romero over the years, and I've had an opportunity to talk with some of the production team. And it's always kind of, I have literally in my office, I have a little vial of dirt from the actual cemetery where they filmed it. I am a crazy Night of the Living Dead fan, and I love how it just changed not only the game for horror or for zombies, it changed the game for me by saying here was a person or a team without millions of dollars in special effects and having this enterprise needed. This was a ragtag team of filmmakers renting a farmhouse and making it happen. And that to me was a huge light bulb moment of pick up the camera and go. I never looked back.
Yeah, you're absolutely right that I think Night of the Living Dead is such an important independent film because even now, looking back 50 years plus later, there's something so charming about how lo-fi it is. Because, we've seen so many massive zombie movies. We've also seen so many low-budget zombie movies, and they're all cut from the same cloth, right? Like, now that you see any low-budget zombie movie that you see now is it just has all the DNA of Night of the Living Dead, because Night of the Living Dead is the original indie, let's just get some people in makeup, let's go out into the country, and let's board ourselves up in a house with a zombie invasion.
Yeah, I think that, and earlier in the mid '90s, this huge wave of independent filmmakers, Robert Rodriguez, Rebel Without a Crew, and all this stuff came out. But you got to rewind the clock way, way, way back to when Night of the Living Dead came out, because that was the quintessential moment where filmmakers picked up cameras and shot films, and no one knew where Night of the Living Dead was going to go. And it did change the course of cinema, very differently than a film like Star Wars, but subtly, to a point where a lot of filmmakers were inspired to say, I could pick up a camera, I can make a very accessible movie. And I think that horror trope of, limited cast, limited locations, keep your costs down, put as much on screen as possible, that playbook comes from George A. Romero. He wrote the book on, keeping it contained, but having a social message. And I think that you see that with, Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead and Land of the Dead. And you get to see the evolution of his creation through, having a social commentary way before, horror movies were deemed even, cinema. They were mainly just played at drive-ins or trash cinema, unless you
B-movies,
Dracula.
right? Yeah, you would have horror movies padding out a block of other movies, right?
Yeah, or playing at drive-ins or late night cinemas. So this was a way of making horror very accessible, and I think that way before social media, that this film generated buzz on status alone. It wasn't ads, it wasn't Facebook notifications. This film generated buzz and stayed in theaters and stayed in screenings for decades because of how popular and how groundbreaking it was as a film. And it changed me as a filmmaker for sure.
Yeah, and in a way, it not only did it make horror accessible, I think it also kind of made new Hollywood happen, right? Like, I don't know
Absolutely.
if Scorsese and Lucas would have been able to do what they did without having an independent filmmaker come in and disrupt the entire system.
Yeah, it was game changing for sure. And I think a lot of, huge filmmakers, including Quentin Tarantino and people like that, really praise his body of work, especially his early work, for, being so groundbreaking and accessible, and having a social commentary, and having a very well written black and white zombie film that can actually stand the test of time. And it was the first horror film to ever be accepted into the National Film Archives. It just moved a lot of roadblocks for me in my mind to say, this is accessible. This is possible as to be a filmmaker, and you don't need to have a traditional studio backing. You and a group of friends or filmmakers can go out, make a movie, and it can be successful, and it can be good.
Yeah. Now, before we wrap up this section, I want to know your take on the age-old question: slow zombies or fast zombies?
Wow, that's a question as old as time itself. I personally slow zombies,
Okay.
but with
Why?
that being said, because I just think it's they're, I don't know, the corpses, in a sense, it plays into that they would be slow based on zero science of reanimated corpses, but
Yeah.
it feels to me that they
Hypothetical
would be
science,
slow.
right?
But I think Zack Snyder's Dawn of the Dead, and I think Danny Boyle's 28 Days Later um, breathed kind of new life into a genre that seemed so accessible that a lot of people worldwide accessed it. Let's do a low budget zombie movie and hope for the best, right? But I think that Danny Boyle and Zack Snyder, they breathe new life into it with fast zombies. I'm always going to be a slow zombie person.
It makes sense,
I do
right?
think I think both are cool, both are unique, and I think that the film itself gets more topical when you talk about zombies, due to ongoing pandemics or global
Yeah.
pandemics, about how fast viruses could in fact spread if they evolved right or changed right, or if we had something like this. So I think the fast zombies are scarier in a sense because of their Olympic athlete speed, but also just that they're very crazed and unhinged as a character. When the
Hmm.
slow zombies and Night of the Living Dead and like Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead, us the humans are more the villains of those stories. Where I think movies like 28 Days Later and Dawn of the Dead, the focus is really on these superhuman zombies or
Yeah.
superhuman infected. So they play differently. They really do, they resonate differently, and I think the George A. Romero kind of slow zombies resonate more as the monsters are us, and we're being kind of taken over by Mother Nature, kind of back to more of an animal kind of lifestyle, where instead of like live horses, you have these zombies roaming around. And I think that with the fast zombies, it's definitely a heightened scare, but in a different direction.
So the next category that I gave you, Chris, was motivation. So this is a movie that came to you at a point in your career when you were getting started with your career. So it's a movie that pushed you forward and pushed you into making a movie and breaking out. So the movie you gave me for this was Pulp Fiction, which is, just another small indie movie like Star Wars. Yeah, I don't think anyone would have heard of it. If you guys haven't seen it, it's just another tiny movie. It's about two friends that really love cheeseburgers and feet. Um,
Again, a very accurate description. Um,
Really,
yeah,
if you would
yeah,
summarize it. And then there's
it
a
will.
boxer, and he does some stuff too. You
Yeah,
watch in the ass. Yeah.
Pulp
Uh,
Fiction, the best,
yeah.
the best.
When did you first see Pulp Fiction?
Way younger than I would like to admit, but I believe I was in the seventh or eighth grade when I first watched it. I watched it on Showcase. I remember watching it. I had a small 13-inch television in my room, and I watched it on Showcase. It was edited at the time, but I watched
Yeah.
it, and literally my jaw hit the floor when I realized that the film was out of sequence, and the story
Right.
being told really only paid off at the end. It wasn't linear storytelling, which I've never seen before up until that time. And it was done in a way that you couldn't even like blink too long, or you would miss something that was crucial of you piecing together this puzzle. And I think that
Hmm.
what happened with that script, again, very accessible, and definitely coming from the indie world, that these films weren't set out to be mega blockbusters. Night
Oh
of the
no,
Living Dead,
that
Star
was
Wars,
definitely
and
not
Pulp
in
Fiction.
anyone's mind.
This is all organic, and I think that that's what draws me to it. A lot of films are setting out to say we are going to be the best, the biggest blockbuster movie in the world. We're going to do that. We're going to set out and do that. But the films that we've talked about, up until including Pulp Fiction, they never had that mantra going into it. This was just make
Right.
a very accessible at the time drama. But I was in a transitional period myself. I was in public school, going to high school, and I was excited knowing that my high school had film classes, and you could make films in high school. But I've never made a film at this point yet. I've watched films. I've played with action figures on the floor, but I've never actually got an opportunity to make a film or to be on a film set. And I knew I was months away from that. And then after I saw Pulp Fiction, by saying like, in the same vein of like Night of the Living Dead, it comes back to script, and it comes
Yeah.
back to story and what story you want to tell. And having a story told not in the correct order means that you really have to pay attention to that story. And that story is going to move you, make you laugh, make you cry. And Pulp Fiction really has all those scenes. And it was just this way of, it doesn't need to have this third act impact. It
Yeah.
can just be a tale of numerous people and how their lives intersect. And I think that how Pulp Fiction does it so uniquely is that everybody feels like real people in an exaggerated world. So
Yeah.
you totally buy into that. You know, you're having these conversations with a boxer or a hitman or you know, a mob boss, but it feels like you're having conversations with your neighbor. Like
Hmm.
all these kind of villains or unique characters all kind of come together in this very unique way. And I think that I've never seen a film. I remember the film ending, and it's like, you know, thanks for watching Pulp Fiction. Up next, an encore presentation of Pulp Fiction. I was like, I'm in. I'll watch the whole thing again because I
Back
wanted
to
to
back.
now start to pick up the groundwork that they were putting in because of the film being out of order, that you can really go back, rewatch the film, and it gives you different perspective of how the story is being crafted. I was blown away.
It is such an incredible film. I mean, that's another one that I feel like has just been a favorite of mine forever. I feel like it's everyone's favorite.
Yeah,
But what I find so special about it is, like you said, it's real people talking, and they're exaggerated people, but they're still having real conversations. And I just love that that Tarantino managed to take breaks in the plot just to like let these two hitmen be
yeah,
people. You know, they're not
yeah.
men of
Just
action; they're men of words.
burgers, about travel, about you know,
Feet,
what they did on the weekend, feet. It's a very, you know, I feel like the characters themselves are very normal. It's the
yeah.
world that they're in is slightly more cinematic. But
Well, it's
having
Pulp
conversations
Fiction.
with your friend in a car about coming back from a trip, in any other film, that would be maybe a throwaway scene or bridging
Yeah.
the gap. But the way this story is crafted is that it really speaks to you in the moments in between. And you know, the one of the most famous, again, pulp references is, you know, Royale with cheese. Two hitmen, two violent offenders, two criminals, two lifelong gangsters, and they're talking about cheeseburgers.
Yeah.
Seems like a conversation you'd have with your best friend, but yet these are two gangsters and they seem so normal. And the
Hmm.
violence that they're incorporating throughout the day, that's just another day at the office. And that's why it's always so downplayed. The, you know, the big action sequences or things like that are always so downplayed. It's the moments in between where we really get to see who these characters are and, you know, what these characters are feeling, which I was blown away by it. I literally watched it right after it aired again. So
That's awesome. I I just watched it again. Actually, I watched all of these movies again in preparation for this podcast and this discussion. And my roommate had never seen Pulp Fiction before, so I watched it with her, and she was so shocked that it was 2.5 hours when it ended, because you know it got dark outside, and she was like, "That did not feel like 2.5 hours." And something that I realized is that there is definitely not 2.5 hours worth of plot in Pulp Fiction, but the dialogue scenes stretch it out and make it feel like it's 90 minutes most.
yeah, no, I think that the way that it's crafted, and again, using the nonlinear storytelling as kind of its platform, is that it keeps you so engaged because as soon as you start to figure out that it's not in the traditional order, it really does give these characters a very unique platform to be themselves, whatever that is. But
Yeah,
it does give them these moments that you're, instead of, you know, shooting up a big diner, they're doing the opposite. They're just talking about shooting up a diner. So it's a very unique way, and it has to be, you know, beautifully crafted in the script, rooted in the script, to have those moments. And you know, the cast just brings it to life by having some A-list celebrities all the way down to random cameos. It makes it that you're so excited to turn the page because you don't know what the next scene will actually entail.
I'm really fascinated that you chose Night of the Living Dead and Pulp Fiction back to back, because I think that they go together perfectly. Because Night of the Living Dead in the '60s, George A. Romero, you spoke about it. George A. Romero kind of revolutionized independent filmmaking. It was no longer you had to be a part of the studio system to make a movie. It was you could just grab a camera, grab some friends, and make a film. And Pulp Fiction obviously is bigger than that, but Tarantino's part of that whole Sundance gang of the '90s. Robert Rodriguez, And even you look at Reservoir Dogs, you look at Pulp Fiction, and these are independent movies. And now the landscape's shifted so that it's no longer studio pictures. It's independent pictures are king.
Yeah, I think that the movement that both those filmmakers put kind of the path in motion for accessible independent filmmakers. And though Pulp Fiction much bigger budget than Night of the Living Dead,
Oh yeah,
that the core value of it is the same. It is still at the time a very inexperienced person behind the director's chair and the writing chair, only doing Reservoir Dogs before, obviously mega hit, but kind of going into that mentality of it comes from within, this magic comes from within. And I think that if we can just put it on the page, we can win over the audience. And I think that Pulp Fiction, it has that. And it also has the cool factor, which is only Tarantino can showcase this type of cool factor. So I think that Night of the Living Dead and Pulp Fiction, and it's funny because Tarantino also big Night of the Living Dead fan, that I think that these are milestones in independent cinema. And though often a lot of people say my favorite movie is Pulp Fiction or whatever, I think it's because at the time, no one has seen a movie like Pulp Fiction. And you had a million movies trying to be Pulp Fiction after 2 Days in the Valley, Killing Zoe, like all these people, all these filmmakers tried to recreate that magic, very much like how
it's
people
lightning in a bottle
tried to recreate Night of the Living Dead with all these lo-fi zombie films that followed. So I think that the voice has to be really authentic. And I think that that's why Pulp Fiction and Night of the Living Dead really do stand out. Because I always joke that like no one has ever set out to make a bad movie. So that's why you get these cult status films of like The Room or Night of the Living Dead.
Oh yeah.
People are like, oh man, it's like so bad it's good. Well, like nobody sat down and was like, let's make the worst movie. Everyone sat down to say, let's make the best movie and cult status will follow. And I think that that's where a lot of the lo-fi zombie movies or the straight to DVD or VHS Pulp Fiction-esque films in the 90s, because that they were like, let's try to recreate this versus let's try to do something on our own. And that originality of Tarantino's voice and Romero's voice really scream loudly in both those pictures.
Right on. So we're going to move on to our next category, which is desperation. So I asked for a movie that represented desperation for Chris. And this one's kind of a fun one because desperation meaning at a point in your career when things were a little bit tougher. Things were, you were kind of questioning why film was worth it. And the movie that you gave me actually isn't one movie. It's 23 movies. So thanks a lot for that one. We're going to be talking about the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe and what it means for movies. So, Chris, because you gave me 23 movies, I got to punish you a little bit here. I need you in 2 or 3 sentences. Actually, I'll give you 20 seconds, and I need you to sum up the entire MCU for me. Just so that our viewers know what's going on if they haven't seen all the films. Just try your best. 20 seconds.
A group of mix mash superheroes come together to save the world and fight against 6 Infinity Stones that have the power to change life on Earth as we know it. So that's kind of the sum up of those 23.
Yeah.
Some don't have, obviously, mention of the Infinity Stones, but that's kind of the overarching story. And
yeah, see, I think I would have said a billionaire makes a robot suit for fun, and then suddenly half the world is extinct.
That's very close. It's taking chapter 1 and chapter 2. But yeah, no, I think as you mentioned, filmmaking, super fun and super great, and my absolute dream job. But it's challenging and it's really non-traditional in the sense. And I think that maybe everyone has a friend who's a filmmaker or aspires to be a filmmaker. It is challenging and there are challenges in the not just making a film and the challenges that come with that, but it's very non-traditional. I don't remember ever seeing filmmaker at career day, and I don't remember ever seeing key grip or gaffer or production manager at those job fairs either. Mm-hmm. It's not something that in a traditional sense that you graduate school, and you put on a suit and tie, you get a check every 2 weeks, white picket fence type of lifestyle. I filmmaking is tough. It's challenging, and there are hurdles, and there's obviously hurdles in the job about locations and right casting and right script and finding money and finding a budget and finding a team and finding distribution. There's all those individual challenges, but you yourself have to keep yourself motivated, and you yourself have to think of this think of a way to put a very positive spin on the lows and even the highs sometimes, and really think about why you want to be a filmmaker. Because the old joke in the industry is that there's definitely easier ways to make money. So
Hmm.
you really do have to love it, and it's not just like, oh, I love my job, or I love this movie. You have to love it as a whole. And every filmmaker, myself included, has struggled with that. And whether you're Christopher Nolan or myself, you've had a moment. You've had a moment of doubt, or you've had a moment of, is this really for me? Maybe the film has failed. Maybe the film didn't turn out the way you wanted it to. Maybe the film that you were really hoping would get made never did, or still hasn't. It's challenging. And at that
Yeah.
point, I was working in tech mainly, not as a producer. I was doing camera and lighting, which is definitely where my kind of origin story, since we're talking about the MCU, my origin story
Yeah.
from camera and lighting, and I did it for many, many years. And I was in this time where I'm looking to make films or be involved as a producer or director, and transition more as a filmmaker. And that's when Iron Man came up, about a person who wanted to reinvent himself, and a person who saw a grander vision for himself that he could put himself on. And I was a huge comic book fan growing up. It was definitely not as cool that it is today. When I was growing up, usually you were teased for reading comics versus praised or having them framed on your wall.
Yeah, it's mainstream now,
It's
right?
totally
People are like, it being a nerd is cool now.
cool, right? When I would wear a Captain America shirt when I was 11, that was not cool, and now it's cooler than cool, right? So
Yeah.
I think this idea of this MCU, this chapter, this really large scale story that intersects spin-offs and whatever, again, takes right from the page of George Lucas in the cinematic sense,
Yeah.
but also just that source material and honoring it. And I think there's so many obviously superhero movies before Iron Man, but I feel like the MCU as a whole, and probably what Kevin Feige is really, really known for,
Yeah.
is trying to pull as much from that source material. That feeling of good versus evil is right in the comic books. It's right on the pages, and the characters are already so fantastical. So instead of reinventing the wheel or taking huge creative liberties like with the X-Men franchise,
Yeah.
they tried their best to steer it in a direction where it would be new and feel fresh, but also, if you read the comics, you would get more out of it than if you didn't. And as you can see, I have an Iron Man helmet on my desk. I'm a huge MCU fan, and I love what the MCU continues to do, even after multiple phases or chapters or sequels or
And
spin-offs.
yeah, it's still going.
They still are finding ways to reinvent their own genre, a genre that they have now kind of created and
Yeah.
risen to this pulp culture status. And again, like, Iron Man being a major blockbuster, it was the seeds in which that film planted that was able to grow into this, plethora of entertainment. And I get up at like 6 o'clock in the morning to watch WandaVision before I go to work on
I was going to ask, have you been watching WandaVision?
and I just love it. I love it
It's
because it's so
crazy.
new. It's so crazy. I've never seen a television show or a cinematic piece like WandaVision. Some very traditional storytelling, and then others is a trope of television in itself. So
Yeah.
it's gone in a direction where I think nobody could predict it during Iron Man. But I relate so much with the first one. My favorite being Infinity War, but my that origin story of Iron Man and starting a person who wanted to reinvent himself at a time in which I myself wanted to reinvent myself. I didn't want to become a superhero, but I did want to become a producer, and that was coming out at the same time. So I saw a lot of myself in those characters, and I love the good versus bad, but also doing it in a very grand scale. I just think the MCU as a whole is such a fascinating milestone, because what all these other, big blockbuster type films try to do, even other comic book films try to do, the
Oh, and
MCU
none of them have been
always
able to do
honored
it.
their fans. Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned Kevin Feige, and I want to go back because you're a producer, and I want to touch on Kevin Feige a little bit more, because I think that Kevin Feige might be the greatest producer of all time.
I agree. I think he's a phenomenal producer, and I think that his care is such a balance, and it's inspiring. It's obviously he's a fan himself. It shows.
Oh, absolutely. He cares so much about how this material comes off.
And he wants this story crafted in a way that is also setting up not only a direct sequel probably to that film being made, but spin-offs or tie-ins or Easter eggs about other films that are being made, not necessarily even this calendar year. They could be made years down the road, but he wants to plant the seeds.
Oh, there's a little trail of breadcrumbs going back to the first Iron Man. And the thing that I love about the original Iron Man is that it doesn't feel like that needs to be part of a bigger world.
It does
It
not.
feels self-contained, but there's still all these hints that there are future films coming. But obviously, they didn't know that it was going to be this. You know, I in preparation for the podcast, I watched Iron Man again, and then I watched Endgame just to watch the bookends.
To cap them off. Yeah.
Yeah, and it is insane that over the course of 10 years, you go from it being a reach to be like, oh, can we cast Robert Downey Jr., and Kevin Feige being like, no, he's right for the role. We need him for this role. And to go from that, where it wasn't even a sure thing that Iron Man was going to be big, to suddenly a beloved character is a talking raccoon.
Of course.
And, you can have 40, 50 characters on screen, and we know every single one of them. We know their story. We know how it goes. It's phenomenal what Kevin Feige has managed to build.
I'm blown away. And when I started getting into producing, when first Iron Man came out, and to where I am now, the MCU has helped me so much along the way, because about a year and a half ago, I transitioned to primarily doing a lot of genre pictures, to doing a lot more different genres. And one of the genres that I primarily work in now, outside of horror, is kind of these Christmas movie romance films. And when I was just coming off back-to-back horror films, I got brought a script to say, do I want to do this Christmas film? And at the moment, my first initial reaction was like, no, I do not want to do that. I want to do another horror picture that I've done back-to-back horror pictures. This is what I do horror pictures. But I read the script, and I sat down with the script, and I really wanted to find something in me that was like, let's make this movie. It was a good script, and the cast was really great, and it was a good budget film, and I wanted to find something in me that would motivate me to wanting to make this film, because I associate so much with horror. I know how to get motivated behind the horror film. And what helped me get into the mindset of romance or Christmas movies was the MCU, because of the fandom of romance Christmas movies and Christmas movies, and the those traditional Hallmark or Lifetime style Christmas movies are so popular. They're incredibly popular. They have their own conventions.
Way more than you would think, right? Like,
and everybody,
there's millions of subscribers.
When I would post a Facebook post saying, hey, check out this horror movie, I would have, friends and family comment. When I started to do romance films, and I was like, check out my romance film, I had people from high school, from college, aunts, uncles being like, can't wait to tune in. I didn't know the fandom for these Christmas movies and romance movies were so big. And the MCU helped me find that by saying, my nerdiness is the MCU, but other people's nerdiness are romance Christmas movies. So it really helped me find that motivation to say, I get fandom. I understand fandom.
Right.
So if I'm making these romance Christmas movies, I'm making them for the romance Christmas fans, and the fandom is huge. So I immerse myself in, romance and Christmas projects. I spoke with other romance and Christmas producers and filmmakers, and they were like, the audience will tell you, it's like no other genre. The audience will be, listen, we like this type of trope. We like this type of how it plays out. We like these types of characters. We like these types of actors and actresses. That genre, just like the MCU, being like, wow, it doesn't feel like it's true to the comic book. The MLWs, the movies of the week, if you don't
Yeah.
nail that traditional, structure or vibe or that feeling of love, then those fans are going to write off that movie too. So you
Oh, yeah.
do have to find that fandom. And the MCU helped me find that, because I totally understand being nerdy about something. So I could get behind being nerdy about romance films too.
So what you're saying is you're teasing your own movie of the week cinematic universe,
I've
all
been
set at Christmas time,
using it for
right?
years, but yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, you just need Samuel L. Jackson to show up in a post-credits scene and say, I want to let you know about the Christmas initiative,"
Absolutely.
right?
I
And
it really helped. It honestly,
yeah,
it put a lot of things in perspective, that the audience for these films are very passionate about it, and I'm very passionate. I'm going to see the newest Marvel movie on opening night with my large popcorn and my large drink with the little figure topper, and
oh
I'm
yeah,
there. And when we release a Christmas movie or a romance film, people are in their seats with their snacks at home in front of, say a network like the W Network. They're tweeting, they're excited. They have seen, this actor or this actress in other genre pictures for them. And they're
yeah.
excited to see their genre stars. And, my genre stars are like Tony Todd, but like their genre stars are totally different within their genre that they're passionate about. And the MCU really helped navigate that for me by saying it doesn't matter what you're nerdy about, as long as you're nerdy about something.
That's awesome. Before we move on, I want to know, you said Avengers Infinity War is your favorite
Yes.
MCU movie. I want to get a top three. What's your top three?
Yeah, I would put, if you'll let me, I'll put Infinity War and Endgame kind of as chapter
Yeah,
one,
they
two
can
of
be.
the same.
Yeah.
I actually just wrote this. My friends and I were talking about it as WandaVision comes to a conclude in the next couple of weeks. So we were just talking about our highlights. But Infinity War and Endgame as kind of number one. Absolutely love the Winter Soldier. I think that
Incredible. Yeah, that's one of my
up
favorites.
until very recently that was my favorite, and I think Guardians of the Galaxy would be my number three. And I think that again, what you were mentioning about you go from a man in a metal suit, which we can all kind of get behind, to virtually a talking tree and a raccoon, in which
Yeah.
you kind of scratch your head by saying, how did we get here in just 10 years? But I think that Guardians of the Galaxy to me felt closer to a Star Wars film than an
Oh,
MCU movie.
it's
So
Star Wars DNA is all over Guardians.
it feels very right for me to and plus James Gunn is a genre filmmaker himself, starting
Slither, Super.
yeah, and like starting with way before that with like Trauma
Yeah.
in New Jersey and things. So the threads for him in Star Wars and genre are so rich. So love Guardians, and I loved just the cast chemistry is just insane. So
The final category that I gave you was appreciation. So now, at this point in your career, you have, for all intents and purposes, made it. You are a producer actually, you're the head of production at Vortex Production, which is incredible. And so now I want to hear about a film that at this point you're appreciating, right? You're not looking at breaking in now. You've broken in. What are you appreciating right now? The film you gave me is Last Call, directed by Gavin Michael Booth. And I want to thank you for this recommendation, because it's a film that I don't know if I would have ended up watching or come across had you not recommended it to me. And I think that a lot of our audience will feel the same, because this is an incredible movie. So before we get too deep into talking about it, because this is it's a smaller movie than Pulp Fiction or the MCU, I want to hear a little bit more about it, and I'm sure our audience would want to hear about it, because likely a lot of us won't be familiar with the film. So can you just describe what is Last Call? Like, what's your selling points on
Yeah,
this?
so Last Call is a Canadian independent feature about a person who is struggling with depression and calls a like a hotline for support, in which the hotline is closed and the head of the cleaning staff picks up the call. And so she and this person who's very depressed and who's debating taking his own life, it's their conversation. The whole film is them on the phone, sharing personal stories about both of them, hoping that she can kind of talk him out of the actions that kind of he is hoping to do later on that evening. The film deals with mental health. The film deals with connection. Film deals with the sense of connecting even though you're not in the same room. And how that film is all tied together is that it is filmed in 2 consecutive one takes.
Yeah.
And I know the whole one take filmmaking thing has been done with 1917 and
Never like this
other
though.
films, but never like this. This is 2 stories, split screen, the entire film. Which, when I was first hearing about this film being made, I thought that was going to be obviously very distracting or very hard to follow with 2 simultaneous images going at the same time. But the way this story comes to be, again, very accessible. I won't say it's easy, but very accessible story and very accessible film that it kind of takes you through an emotional ride. And I was very honest with the director when I watched the film that I said I can't remember the last time that I was this emotional in a movie theater, that I found it so grounded in what you think you would do in these scenarios, that it hits so close to realism that it feels like you're also on this journey. And
Mm-hmm.
because the film is shot in 2 consecutive one takes, and it's true, they did consecutively shoot. They never broke. Unlike in 1917, where you can kind of use
Or Birdman,
camera tricks to kind of pan out of it. This was 2 entirely one takes, and they had to rehearse for days and days. They had to stop recording when accidentally they saw one of them in a reflection. So the idea to tell this story the way that they did, it moved me, and it is really, really a powerful film.
Mm-hmm. It really is, and like it's just so powerful to watch, especially the performances in the film. I think are so powerful. Specifically, the woman who plays Beth.
Yes.
She's incredible in it,
Yeah.
and like I got really emotional at the climax of the film when
Yeah.
everything's going down and she's just desperately trying. One thing you forgot to mention is that it's not that she works at a helpline. It's a wrong number.
It's a wrong number.
Right?
Sorry. Yes, it's a
Yeah.
wrong number.
So she's not prepared for this
No, she's
whatsoever.
not prepared. Yeah.
Um, it's so powerful.
Yeah. And I remember watching that, and I think that as a filmmaker, when you watch films or when you see ideas or when you see concepts, you're just like, oh man, like I wish like I thought of that. Like it happens
Yeah.
so often, and I think that even big filmmakers say it as well, that you're just like, oh man, it's such a good idea. It's such an amazing concept. Like, how come I didn't think of that? And
Yeah.
it's like watching that movie, you're like, man, like how come I didn't think of that? Or how come somebody didn't think of that before now? Because it's so beautiful, but it could only be told through Gavin Michael Booth. He's an incredible Canadian filmmaker who splits his time between the US and Canada. His wife is in fact Sarah, the lead. And his team and his collaboration is, again, close friends, pick up a camera, let's go do it. And that spirit shines through this film. And I think that it doesn't feel indie. It doesn't feel like a bunch of friends picked up a camera and ran with it. It feels like a Hollywood drama that could be at the Academy Awards. You could see this film so powerful and so inventive, that it leaves its indie crown and it goes to mainstream cinema because it's so powerful and it's so polished that it doesn't have that indie feel. It just has this very polished Hollywood film.
That said, it being an indie, I am seeing a kind of a recurring theme in your choices here. At Star Wars, that's an independent film that wasn't, they weren't thinking about this being a massive blockbuster. Uh, it was a Hollywood movie, but it was still made like an independent. Night of the Living Dead, it's another one. That's another, you band together with your friends, you make a movie, you do it your way. Pulp Fiction, same thing. It's you've got '90s, the kind of reinvention of the indie and indie becoming king. MCU, not very indie. I mean, although you could make an argument. I mean, Iron Man was made outside of the Hollywood system. That was an independent film. Although wasn't really it was made for box office success, but it was independent. But the coming to this, this is a 2019 film. Hasn't been released yet to the public, so it's I believe actually I saw it's coming out. By the time this episode releases, it will be available online to watch. I believe for rental. So definitely go check it out. But at the time of recording this, it's not even released technically yet. And so you kind of have. I love your choices because they kind of take us on a journey through indie filmmaking. And
yeah, I think that the re-evolution of indie filmmaking is so inspiring because it speaks to the times. It speaks to what's going on in the world, and it speaks to what's going on creatively in the world. That these people, had that renegade filmmaker enthusiasm. I'm sure even Kevin Feige and Jon Favreau, who directed Iron Man 1, but also directed a lot of that Sundance movement as well with swingers and things like that. So these people do come from these humble beginnings or these independent beginnings, and they use that mentality in the Hollywood structure. So I think that though Iron Man and the MCU is definitely by no means, a traditional independent film and was definitely made to soar at box offices, the approach of storytelling and the approach of accessibility comes from that independent background. And I think that that's why a lot of the MCU movies are established from directors who aren't necessarily massive blockbuster directors, but they know how to tell a story. And I think the best example is Black Panther. That film is beautifully made and beautifully shot, and his past body of work are very accessible, comedy dramas where it's just about telling a story, and there's some action thrown in there and stuff as well, but his stories are very grounded. And the director of Doctor Strange, coming from a horror background, and
Sinister, Oculus,
James Gunn, these people Jon Favreau came from this independent world, and they took that independent mentality and they brought it mainstream. And that energy is what really excites me for these films that we chat about it today, because their mentality is, my generation has the ball and I'm going to run with it. And a lot of the films span numerous decades and stand the test of time because they had the ball at that point in time and they ran with it. And if there wasn't a Night of the Living Dead and there wasn't a George A. Romero, there probably wouldn't be a Quentin Tarantino the way we know it. And, if it wasn't a George Lucas, there probably wouldn't be an MCU the way that we know it. And I think that these past filmmakers inspire the next generation of filmmakers. And I think that, The Last Call to me seemed like such a logical way to end kind of this film journey that we've been on, because again, it goes back to the start where a bunch of friends have picked up the camera in the digital age and have made a film that's so impactful. It's very similar to how George A. Romero and a group of his friends picked up a film and made it so impactful. Different stories, different mentalities, but that goal of accessibility and making the film the way they want to make it, they're the same in a sense. So I think that that's why we've come to a point in cinema where you can see fantastical worlds things blow up, planets, different adventures, space, the final frontier, whatever you want to be. And now here we're back in 2021 reviewing very accessible indie Canadian cinema. We've gone from a roller coaster of very small to the biggest possible films in the world, back down to very small, accessible, independent films. So I love the way that they approach things. These groundbreaking filmmakers.
Mm-hmm. And what you said about digital, a film like Last Call could not happen without the innovations that have happened in digital cinema.
It couldn't have been shot on film. There was no reel long enough, so it physically couldn't be done. So,
well, although there are some films that have been shot in one take on film, but at the same time, digital gives the ability to have everything sync up and to be able to have these two locations simultaneously working together to kind of piece together this.
I also just think that with the the accessibility of how light that camera is and the motions that they wanted to do, that it could only have been made in the digital age, and I think that it can only have been accomplished then when the film was shot in 2019. I think that it's so important to say what's going on, and that film, if anything, has only gained more esteem for me. I'm so excited that audiences can see it, because mental health is such a topic now, even more so than it was in 2019, that this film, very much like the other films that we spoke about, will only get more relevant as time goes on. And I think that Last Call is definitely going to be on that list of this cult status of Canadian fringe cinema, where people are going to look back and say, yes, in film school 25 years ago, there was this movie where it was a split screen. And I really do think that this film is just starting its journey. I saw it when it did its theatrical run in Canada, but now for it to hit, streaming services and downloads, I'm very excited.
So we're coming to the end of our discussion today. We've talked about 5 films. Of course, all of these films kind of represent a journey through a career and through a life in movies. So, of course, the only way to finish this is with a completely unrelated question. So I want to ask you a question. It's an alternate take on an old classic question. So the question is, if there's one person, alive or dead, fictional or real, that you could make a sandwich with, who would it be? And the reason, so it's not a dinner question, right? I want to stress there's some criteria here, right? You want to think about, it's not just who would you want to sit down and talk with, because you're making a sandwich beside that person. You're not necessarily talking the entire time. You also have to think about, what type of sandwich would that person make? Would it be, what would be someone that you might want to sit down for dinner with, right? I would want to sit down for dinner with Quentin Tarantino. I would not want to make a sandwich with him. I feel like he'd make some boring ham and cheese with ham and cheese and butter on white bread, and that would be Quentin Tarantino's sandwich, and it would taste like feet, and he wouldn't stop talking, right? But I would want to make a sandwich with Samuel L. Jackson.
Sure. Yeah.
Right? So who's your sandwich person?
My sandwich person, very unique question, very very fun question. My one of my favorite kind of filmmakers is Fulci. He directed The Beyond and Cat in the Brain and these very bizarre giallo Italian films, and I love his entire body of work. I think he's such a fascinating person, and his personality in life is even bigger than his random cameos that he has in his films. So I would put Fulci at the top of the list, making sandwich. I'm sure it's going to be this crazy Italian sandwich. But I love.
You have Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I'm just saying I love him as a person. I think he's such a fantastic director and filmmaker. He's so bizarre and weird, and I've seen him in interviews, and I own a lot of his posters from around the world that I've gathered. But I think it would be a very bizarre lunch for sure. Very bizarre.
It definitely, I feel like that would, and you have a good instinct to go with a 1970s giallo, Italian filmmaker, because I feel like the food would be delicious.
It would be amazing, and I think
it would, and you'd have good conversation. It'd be weird.
It would be weird. And I think you're right, though.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be the stereotypical like sit down dinner. Like I think that if I had an opportunity to like sit down and like have dinner and like really ask a bunch of questions and take notes or whatever, I think that I would obviously maybe potentially pick other people, but I think kind of just like making a sandwich, maybe in your kitchen or maybe in his kitchen.
Yeah.
I think Fulci would be a ride. I think that it would be pretty bizarre time.
Yeah, it's an experience, right?
Yeah.
That's what the whole question is getting at. Well, I want to thank you so much for coming on to our show, Chris. It's been really great having you here. But before you leave, I just want to hear a little bit. What are you working on at the moment?
Well, first off, thanks so much for having
me.
It was it's super fun. Great way to kind of kick off the day. So it was really fun conversation for sure. And what I'm working on now is various films across the board. I have 3 or 4 movies in post right now. I go to camera for a new movie in 10 days, and I'm already in prep for another movie that I'm shooting in April. So it's busy. The slate is full. A lot of the films that I'm currently working on right now are in the romance genre, but some really exciting horror and drama projects coming later on in this year. And I'm very fortunate to be in the position that I am now because I know how many films I want to shoot this year. And I'm so fortunate to be working with Vortex Productions, who allows me to shoot endless movies. It feels like even during the global pandemic of last year, we still shot 6 films in 2020.
Wow.
So, and which a lot of infrastructure put in to make that happen. But I have such a rich slate of different genres and different tasks and different projects ahead that I'm very, very excited for the weeks and months to come. And I have an amazing team. It's such an amazing team to work with. So it's full of line producers and production managers who are all aspiring, major filmmakers and huge voices in the space. So I'm just so lucky to be doing back-to-back films, and literally back-to-back. Like I just wrapped a movie 2 weeks ago, and I'm already back into prep for another movie that goes to camera in less than 10 days. So it does feel like, more of a, traditional job sense, because I know that I am virtually doing a movie every 2 weeks. So it's great. I can't wait to dive into the next project and the project after that, and continue my journey in cinema.
Awesome. And how can we connect with you afterwards? Are you on social media? Is there any way we can kind of keep touch?
I'm on Facebook. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Twitter. And all with just like my name, Christopher Giroux. If you search it, it will come up. But I'm very active on social media. I like to show what's playing, what I have playing worldwide, but also some behind the scenes or some tips and tricks that we're picking up along the way. And it's cool to showcase that. So if you're definitely a movie fan or a comic book fan or a genre fan, my social media is full of behind the scenes or what's coming up or what I'm working on or what I'm reading or what I'm tinkering with in the background. So but yeah, definitely all over social media, so feel free to add me and come check out what we're doing.
Perfect. We'll have all of that info in the podcast notes. I'll do that in the outro. But thank you so much again for joining us today, Chris. It's been a blast having you here.
Yeah, thank you.
And I really look forward to keeping up with what's going on in your career.
Yeah, stay in touch for sure. And it sounds like you already have some threads into Vortex Productions. So hopefully those threads get stronger as the time goes on. And yeah, it's always just fun to talk about movies, and especially some of the movies that we got to talk about today, being some of my fan favorites. It's great to relive some of those highlight movie moments of my career.
And cut. That's a wrap for Take 3 of Take 5 Action. I want to thank our guest, Chris Giroux, for joining us today. If you want to see more of Chris, you can check out our show notes for his socials and website and any more information on him. Be sure to subscribe to Take 5 Action wherever you get your podcasts, or you can find us at our website, fcff.ca. Take 5 Action is a podcast produced in collaboration with the Forest City Film Festival.
And major thank yous go out to our producer, Nandita Dutta, for making all of this happen, as well as our media consultant, Keith Tomasek, our editors, Juliana Estrada and Jeffrey Bremner, and all of our partners at OI Art. Thank you for tuning in. Make sure you join in next week as we talk with film director Robert Boudreau about Bob Dylan, auteur cinema, and anti-hero characters. My name is Matthew Downs, and I'm the host and creator of this show, and I can't wait to see you at the movies.